To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. It is important that after 14 years in government, the Conservative Party rebuilds, but also that it takes up its crucial role in opposition, professionally and effectively.
Too late, my time has come, sent shivers down my spine.
My plan is to build a mass national movement.
Goodbye, everybody. I've got to go. Gotta leave you all behind and face the truth. Mama, ways the wind blows. Didn't mean to make you cry. If I'm not back again this time tomorrow, carry on, carry on.
For too long now, we've turned a blind eye as millions slid into greater insecurity. Nurses, builders, drivers, carers, people doing the right thing, working harder every day. Recognised at moments like this before, yet as soon as the cameras stop rolling, their lives are ignored. Not this time.
Welcome to Newsnight. Friday night, there's been a political earthquake across the UK. As you know, the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, with a majority almost as big as Tony Blair's in 1997, has promised you a government of service. So when will you begin to notice the change he has pledged? The Tories have had their worst election result in history. Shell-shocked Conservatives are asking how will they ever rebuild their party. The SNP are doing major soul-searching too after their collapse. The Lib Dems, the Greens, Plaid, Reform, the Independents, with their phenomenal results, are all working out how they will use their power in the Commons to put pressure on the Labour government. The new House of Commons, by the way, opens for preliminary business on Tuesday. To digest the transfer of power from one party to another and assess last night, and to look forward, of course, we have for you tonight a stellar political panel. We've got Phil Collins, former Blair and Starmer speechwriter. We've got Joe Tanner, former advisor to Boris Johnson. Luke Trilly's here from the pollsters More in Common, and historian David Olusoga. And as always, Nick, our political editor. There are not many people on this sofa who've had very much sleep, so I'm very grateful that you stayed up for our audience on this important Friday night. David Olusoga, your assessment of what's happened in the last 24 hours.
Well, what's really struck me is that although the Westminster calculations, the who's in, who's out, that story obviously is floating around, how quickly this has become a sombre moment. We're very quickly talking about the challenges facing the government. There's not even a honeymoon period 24 hours into the election results. And I think that speaks to the thing which I've heard over and over again, this profound sense that the country is deeply damaged, that nothing works. So that the scale of the task, I think, is somewhat inhibiting the kind of celebratory mood. It doesn't really feel like 1997 in that very profound way.
Joe Tanner, what do you say?
I'd agree, actually. I think there's definitely people I spoke to, friends in the area that my constituency actually went from being a very Tory area, South East London, and went to Labour. And there wasn't a sense of, oh, this is amazing. It's actually just, come on, folks, we need you to get on with the job now. And I think that was actually the tone that was struck in Downing Street today.
Well, I agree that there's a sombre feel, but from a Labour point of view, let me just introduce a non-sombre note, which is that any political operation which ends up with a majority of 174 has had a colossal triumph. And it absolutely has to be said of the people who've run this operation that it's been a remarkable effort to go from 80 seats down to 174 up. I know the contingent circumstances were favourable. I know the Conservative Party did its level best to help Labour into power. But nevertheless, this is a remarkable turnaround in a very short period of time. And it's worth saying, because Keir Starmer has been underestimated time and time again. And I think that as he goes into government, he'll probably be underestimated again. So, yes, I understand.
OK, well, let's get into this then. Will Keir Starmer govern in the way he campaigned in this election, i.e. super cautiously? In the sense that he'll be careful, yes. But I think you probably saw, I don't want to read too much into his demeanour when he was behind the rostrum in Downing Street, but I, from knowing Keir Starmer a bit, I think he will take to
government, I think he will command it. I think he's impatient with opposition. He hasn't enjoyed it. He doesn't like the fact he can't do anything. So actually, I'm quite optimistic about his capacity to govern well.
And you know, he said something really interesting at Tate Gallery when he did that big speech in the early hours of the morning. He said, "We have changed the Labour Party and we will govern as a changed party." Oh, where did I hear that from? New Labour and all that sort of stuff. And I'm just picking up on what Phil is saying, and I'm slightly nervous saying this because I'm sitting next to the guy who wrote Tony Blair's famous last speech to the Labour conference in 2006. It had that great line in which Tony Blair said, "The one thing I never had to worry about was the wife running off with the bloke next door," because of Cherie Blair famously not being Gordon Brown's biggest fan.
Did you write that, Phil?
Well, Les Dawson wrote it, actually, but I adapted it.
OK, fair enough, OK.
But what I was going to say is I think you could make a case that in personal terms, this is a greater success by Keir Starmer than what Tony Blair did. Because what Tony Blair did was he was the third Labour leader over a 14-year period covering 3 parliaments that took Labour from a big defeat in 1983 to a big win in 1997. Keir Starmer, one person, one parliament. And his challenge, and in a sense, the difficulty he's faced, is what he did to become leader of the Labour Party was the exact and precise opposite of what he's had to do to become Prime Minister. And that's why he got into difficulty in the election campaign over Jeremy Corbyn. That is a serious personal political achievement.
And he looked like he'd thrown it to me. It felt like when he got there today, when he actually got to do that bit in front of number 10, the door of number 10, it felt like he'd chucked the Ming vase and actually relaxed a bit. And that's the person that everyone's been waiting to see because he's been so uptight, so cautious. But he actually looked like the smiles were big. He looked like he was ready for it today. And I think that is going to be the interesting bit about whether he can carry on like that. Yeah.
Well, the truth is he's going to have to chuck the Ming vase because the electorate have now voted for change 3 times. 2016 in the Brexit referendum, 2019 Boris Johnson's big majority, and now again in this election. And the previous 2 times, despite the promise of change, they didn't get it. So if Labour doesn't deliver on that change over this Parliament, it's not only going to mean that this is a one-term government. I actually think it spells something deeper and more worrying for our democracy across the board. OK,
that's interesting. Can we talk about voter volatility? Because they have won 2/3 of the seats with 34% of the vote. So most people did not vote for Labour. What can you tell us about the kind of what some people are describing as the shallowness of the Labour vote? And George Eaton, in Labour supporting New Statesman tonight, says this triumph for Labour feels unusually precarious.
Well, the truth is what happened last night is our political system fractured, left, right and centre. You had the Lib Dems doing very well, you had that big Labour majority, the Tories almost annihilated. But on top of that, you had votes for reform, 4 million votes there, for Greens, for independents. What voters, I think, were saying is, we desperately want change, we desperately want this Tory government out, but we're not sure who is best placed to give us that change and whether the Labour Party have fully made the case to us that they're the ones to do it. And that makes for a very volatile, very undecided electorate with potentially, as has been said, quite a short honeymoon for Keir Starmer.
Let me ask you all, do you believe that things will change as much as Labour supporters want or Labour critics fear?
Well, I feel there's a awareness in the electorate that is reflected in this results of just how deep a hole the country is in. I think there is, because there's been so many offers of change that haven't been delivered, I think there is, again, a somberness, but also a realisation that we need to change the tax system, that we need to find more resources, that we need to deal with productivity, that we are, as I said earlier, that the country is profoundly broken in a way that it wasn't in 1997.
Well, people don't agree on what the change is, do they?
Yeah, what does it mean?
And in actual fact, Boris Johnson did deliver the change he promised. He got Brexit done. It's just people decided in the end they hadn't quite wanted what they said that they wanted, or this wasn't the right version of the thing that they'd fantasised about. But so it's actually quite complex to provide something as abstract as change. I do think there will be a lot of things going on. I think Starmer will do a lot. Whether that satisfies this rather disembodied notion of change, I don't know, because there's no doubt that this is a moment quite unlike previous landslides. There's no question about that. The British system amplifies and exaggerates victory, and it's done so to great effect, whilst, as Luke says, the rest of the politics is fractured.
Can I just push back slightly, though, on that point about Brexit? Because Brexit was never just about leaving the European Union for people. It was people saying, we are not happy with the status quo. And that is where the Johnson government failed. They didn't deliver on levelling up. That was a key promise. These regions of the country... Or reducing immigration. And so in some ways, I think Starmer picks up exactly the same challenge that Boris Johnson had in 2019. The question is, does he deliver on it?
But an even more disaffected sort of electorate who are... The bar has been raised each time. It's kind of, come on, guys, what are you going to give us? What are you going to do? And the challenge with that, when there's no money, you know, that is partly why no one's jubilant. No one thinks there's any money there to go and do half of this stuff.
Although Mick Lynch was on Newsnight a few weeks ago, it was in the election campaign, that feels like a lifetime, saying there is money if you choose to tax wealthier people more. He made the argument for the fact that there is money around. It's just you make a political choice whether you want to tax those people.
There is, and you know the envelope of public spending is enormous, so you can make choices of different priorities within it too. And I think that although everyone's saying already the honeymoon will be very short or may not even exist, you've got to remember the government now has the capacity and the privilege of action. They can do things. They can change that by actually acting and demonstrating that they're attempting to begin the long process of levelling up, for example. I think this conversation can change.
But they do need some luck. Some of what they've said they're going to do is about growth, and growth hasn't been achieved by anybody. So they do need a fair wind, because otherwise they are nailing their colours to something else happening to help them on that journey. And ultimately, it's, you know, all very well setting sail and in a boat and putting the sail up. If there's nothing behind to push it anywhere, you're not going to magic stuff up. So there is a bit of a challenge there that I think for some of the things they want to do and that they're suggesting they're going to do, you're going to have the Tories continually hammering them, and probably other parties.
Well, yeah,
what about this? What about that?
Not just the Conservatives. You will have
speed of things.
You will have reform on the right, and you will have the Lib Dems, Greens.
Sure, but they have got a majority of 170 odd.
100%. So of course they have.
I'm not that bothered.
Okay, fine.
But we've already had the benefit cap issue. Already parts of the Labour Party are coming out. They're all going to start fighting amongst themselves. It's all very well having a lot of people. Yeah. There's only a set number of jobs. How do you keep 418
people disciplined?
Yeah, that's a difficult problem. And it probably will manifest itself quite quickly with planning liberalisation, because you have lots of people, lots of new MPs with a patch to defend and think, well, what do I do here? Well, I do want some development, but just not here.
Yes.
So, it's difficult. But of all the problems that you encounter the day after an election, the fact that we have to make do with trying to satisfy 418 MPs is low down on the things we were worried about.
Lots of them quite
Sorry, it wasn't 418. That was Blair's majority, wasn't it? I've got
412.
412. I beg your pardon.
Not far.
Right, Nick. So today,
few will defect.
The new Prime Minister speaks at the lectern, talks to the nation, and then goes inside and appoints his cabinet. And it's mostly people in the shadow cabinet, apart from those who lost their seats last night. What has he been up to?
Yes, right, and made the appointments very quickly, and very quickly doing the senior ones. So you have Rachel Reeves as Chancellor, you have Pat McFadden as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and Angela Rayner as the Deputy Prime Minister, and Housing and Levelling Up. And Pat McFadden's obviously an interesting one. Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, what that means is you're in the Cabinet Office, which is the engine room of government, and you're sort of enforcing the will of the Prime Minister. Now, that post can be a political graveyard, Jack Cunningham 20 years ago, but it can work. Now, Pat McFadden has a very close relationship with Keir Starmer, highly rated. They hope that will work. They need to hit the ground running. So there'll be more ministerial appointments tomorrow. There's going to be a cabinet meeting on Saturday tomorrow, because they've got to. The only thing they've got is growth. If you're not putting up the main tax rates, you're bringing down debt and you're not increasing borrowing, then the only thing you can go for, as Joe says, is growth. But you have to move really quickly on things like planning. But now they've got a whole bunch of MPs in what one might describe as sort of blue Tory greenish seats. They're not going to be happy about that.
But to the point about having this big majority, they've also already, Keir Starmer's already gone outside of those that have just been elected and created a few new peers. So we've had James Timpson, who is the boss of Timpson's, who's had an amazing career working with sort of offenders and trying to help them with rehabilitation. He's been given a job as Prisons Minister sort of already.
What, so
you can see he's going outside of...
Somebody's going to get annoyed about that or resentful?
Well, I think, there's a bunch of people who've just been elected who expected those jobs. Everyone was upset when David Cameron suddenly went into the Lords and became Foreign Secretary. So already it's like the rules are being bent. I think it's quite clever But I can see a few people that might not like the approach.
And there's Sir Patrick. There's a picture of James Timpson, if you wanted to see what he looks like, and also Sir Patrick Vallance, who's in the Lords. He's the new Science Secretary.
Science.
Yeah.
Another really good move.
Yeah. Luke, sorry, what were you going to say? Oh, I was going to ask you about when we were talking about the volatility of the vote and the independents who've done well in places like Blackburn and Dewsbury and Batley and Leicester South. You've already done some polling on that since last night, haven't you?
We've been looking at this, and it is now abundantly clear that one of the stories we weren't expecting from this electorate is that constituencies where there were a high number of Muslim voters have moved away from the Labour Party, sometimes quite dramatically.
Hopefully we're going to show your graph any second now.
And from focus groups in these areas, what I can tell you is that it is in large part the Gaza factor which has unanchored these voters from the Labour Party.
Can you just explain this, Luke?
Yeah.
Because I did look at this on Twitter and I need you here to talk me through it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is an overview of all the seats that Labour was contesting. And those seats which are in the most strong orange hue are the ones with the highest proportion of Muslim voters in those seats. And the direction of the arrow tells you whether there was an increase in the Labour vote share or a decrease. And just look at those orange seats with a high proportion of Muslim voters moving dramatically away. And that's why, unusually, right, on a night when Labour were making gains across the board, they actually lost seats. They lost Dewsbury, they lost in Blackburn. Jonathan Ashworth, expected to be part of the ministerial team, lost his seat. And it is that effect in those seats, and it is something that the new government is going to have to reckon with pretty darn quick.
What's interesting is that the Labour leadership thought this was going to be an issue because they knew they had that problem when Keir Starmer had that interview on LBC, when the Labour Party was a bit slow to call for an immediate ceasefire. They knew they had a problem, but their thinking was that the Labour high watermark was so high that they would be OK. But the West Midlands mayoral contest was the clue. Ahmed Yaqub got, I think, about 18 to 19% of the vote in Birmingham, the UK's second largest city. The clue was there. And indeed, he gave Shabana Mahmood a very close run in Birmingham and Ladywood.
And all the polls missed that West Midlands mayoral race number for Yaqub. It looks like they've missed it again in this election as well.
This has been a bigger problem because the vote, the Labour lead was not what it was being reported. It was never near 25. It's come down to 10.
Yeah. OK, I'm actually going to play you a clip now of a short clip of the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, when she was addressing civil servants for the first time as she walked into the Treasury today.
It is also a huge privilege to be the first ever female Chancellor of the Exchequer. So every young woman...
That was a very long round of applause from civil servants. Let me introduce you to Meg Hillier, who is Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch. When you see the kind of reception the first woman Chancellor received, how does it make you feel?
Well, very proud. And I mean, you know, Rachel's really earned this. She's put in the hard yards and had pushed a very hard discipline on the Labour Party. And I think has come across to all players as a very serious person who really will do the job very, very properly.
Can she get the highest sustained growth in the G7?
Well, she's set herself some very stiff targets. And
can she do it?
Well, I think if anyone can do it, she can. She's certainly clearly got a plan. But, you know, a lot of it is actually about, you know, managing the fiscal situation we're in as well, because the growth won't come immediately. And so I think she's got, a very hard edge to her, if you like, about making sure that discipline's in place. And I think we need to be really clear that on the doorsteps, when people were asking me and others about, will Labour be putting up taxes, we had to say, no, this is what our position is. And it's really important that we stick to that position because we're going to have to maintain the trust of those voters who've lent us their vote.
And just to be clear, our Newsnight audience knows this, taxes are going up because, as the IFS showed us, taxes would be going up if a Conservative government was re-elected or if a Labour government was coming in. In fact, the IFS graph shows it will be the highest tax take on record. Just pause for a second and just reflect as a Labour MP. Did you ever expect this turnaround from that historic defeat 5 years ago?
No, I'm always a pessimist about elections, I have to say, but even I began to believe it at the beginning of this election campaign, that it could be possible. But it's a phenomenal achievement by Keir Starmer. He has really personally driven this, that he transformed the party into something electable and really set out to try and create that broad coalition that would get us across the line, and also the tactics by our campaign team to make sure that we weren't just stacking up votes in seats that we already held, but that we were really pushing the envelope in seats that people did not think would be Labour territory. And if you look at some of those true blue seats that have now gone red, it is an extraordinary achievement. But there's a truth about the fragility of it as well.
Well, let's ask about that then. Are you worried about the shallowness of the vote? The fact that it's 34% share of the vote, 2/3 of the seats, and, you know, the Tories 5 years ago had an 80-seat majority. We've seen it washed away.
Yeah, I think what was really clear is we know that we couldn't do what we want to do to this country without being in power. And we have, you know, had too long in opposition. I've been both in government and opposition, and I know how miserable it is when I'm visiting my constituents, seeing the problems that they're facing and not really having the traction to deal with it because we were not in government. So getting into government in the first place is absolutely vital to get anything done.
But is there any jeopardy for you because of that vote?
There will be if we don't deliver on what we promised. And so it is about making sure those promises are realistic and getting delivery in place. And look, I've spent a long time looking at delivery in government, and I know the ideas can be great, whether you agree with them or not, but people have policies they love, and then delivery is the challenge, and that's really where Keir Starmer's missions and his plans to get delivery across the line. People like Pat McFadden really is key players in this will help with that.
People who support you and for your critics who are watching tonight, when will people see a difference?
Well, that's why I think some of the things around the health appointments, you know, making sure that you can not waiting for that health treatment that you've been waiting for a long time, and you know you've actually paid for. People waiting years for a hip replacement, for example, is really important. And
when will they see?
Well, that's when. I mean, I'm not going to preempt when Wes will come out with these times, but some of those things, that the promises that were made in the election have to be the quicker deliveries. But what is really interesting, I think, here is I've been on doorsteps, obviously a lot in my own constituency, but also in other places like Wellingborough, which was, although we won it in the by-election, not a dead cert to win. And when I said to people, we can't ever click our fingers, it won't happen immediately, people really understood that. They said, yeah, there's a big mess to clear up. And the British electorate do understand that we can't transform everything overnight.
Yeah.
But we do need to deliver on those early promises.
OK, let's talk about the fact that you lost 5 seats with large Muslim populations. We've just talked about it with Luke Trill, more in Common pollster. 4 went to independents, 1 went to a Conservative. We're talking about Blackburn, Dewsbury, Batley, Leicester South, etc. Ranjess Phillips Close, Shabana Mahmood, as we mentioned, Wes Streeting, because of your Gaza position. And it started with this interview on October the 11th that Keir Starmer gave to LBC. Let's just have a reminder.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Why won't you answer whether you think it's in line with international law or not?
Because I've tried to answer.
That was obviously also Emily Thornberry, who was on this programme on the same day that Keir Starmer had been on LBC in the morning. She was then Shadow Attorney General. So you knew it was an issue. You knew after the local elections it was an issue. People like Ellie Reeves, your colleague, said that Labour had a lot of work to do to win back the support of Muslim voters. You clearly haven't done that. You haven't succeeded.
No, I think that there's a really big issue here, and any party that loses votes, and we've seen exactly where those votes have been lost, really needs to engage and listen and get to grips with the issue, but also
but
talk
it suggests
to those people
that hasn't happened between May and now.
Well, I think that certainly between May and now, I think that on the ground in those seats, I'm sure it was happening, but I think there needs to be a better
work, though.
Well, I think there needs to be a better understanding in the centre of the party about how we deal with all sorts of different communities. There's an awful lot of work that goes on in all parties with focus groups about individuals, but there's a danger as well of lumping people together. And I think we've got to make sure that we're really listening to our MPs in all of the seats that they're in and really understanding what what is affecting people. And you know, clearly we need to have some resolution in the Middle East is going to be a long time coming.
I looked at your Labour manifesto before we started our programme tonight. We are committed to recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to a renewed peace process which results in a two-state solution. Norway, Spain, Ireland have already recognised a Palestinian state. Why can't you do that this weekend?
Well, I mean, David Lammy has already been out publicly talking about his desire to engage with this and make decisions, and it's for him as Foreign Secretary.
But what would you like to see then?
Well, I think
do you want to wait to make it part of renewed negotiations?
Well, look, the thing is, we can call for anything we want, but we do need to have a long-term sustainable solution for peace in the Middle East. And you know, what has happened from the 7th of October and since has been horrendous. Thousands of people have been killed. We know that there's issues, but you know, we've got an Israeli government that doesn't want to engage with a lot of the international community. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think the international community took its eye off the ball for a long time in the Middle East. We've now got, you know, a foreign secretary in place that he was determined to focus on this, and we'll wait and see what he can achieve. But you know, the UK is obviously part of a wider international community delivering on this, but we need to be clearly listening to what people said to us on the 4th of July.
No more ministerial appointments tonight because, hey, it's 20 to 11 on a Friday night. But we're told there'll be more appointments tomorrow. Are you expecting a call about a job, Hillier?
I have had no indication. Otherwise, it's all a matter for Keir Starmer. And I think none of us, I'm sure I speak for my colleagues, feels that we're entitled to anything. So, you know, I'm the MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch. That's a hugely important role, and I'm very happy to have that position again.
Thank you very much for being with us. It's 11 o'clock, by the way. I got the time completely wrong. Thank you very much for being with us. Right, let's talk about the Conservatives. Here is what the new Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee, told our colleagues at BBC Look North this evening.
We've got to, I think, invite Reform voters and Farage to join us, because otherwise, in 5 years' time, we're going to have a similar debacle. We can't have a divided right-wing vote.
So you would welcome in Farage and Reform to the Conservative Party, would you?
I would absolutely welcome him in, join us. If he wants to stand for leader, that would be a matter for our members.
Well, Joe Tanner, as a former advisor to Boris Johnson, why are you smiling at what Edward Lee was saying?
It's just that, you know, they've just had this horrendous night, and it's kind of within... Even actually in the run-up, there was all this talk about Nigel Farage and what role he could play with the Tory party. And the Tory party doesn't really know what it is anymore. It hasn't known for ages. And the idea that it's just going to sort of run in this direction to sort of go and just sort of snaffle what it can from Reform just seems bonkers. I mean,
but the collapse of the party is one of the big political stories of our times. So you can see why there might be knee-jerk reactions.
But that's part of the problem is that, you know, the reason it's collapsed is because it hasn't known what it's been. I mean, so many people within the party itself, there are many politicians that were Tory politicians that couldn't stand half their colleagues because of the different views that they were expressing about Brexit, for example. Ever since the sort of the stopper got taken out of the bottle on that issue, they all just started like fighting like rats in a sack. And then they didn't really even want to be in the same sort of corridors, the same voting lobbies. They didn't even want to sit together in the tea rooms. And so there's been this sort of constant battle amongst itself. And then, of course, what does anyone out there think they're voting for when this lot can't get on anyway? Yeah. Completely ungovernable and has such a range of views that they won't coalesce around something simple for people to get.
I mean, you know, Conservatives are going, oh my goodness, how do we rebuild? We've hemorrhaged voters to Reform. We've also hemorrhaged voters to the Lib Dems. I mean, they're being pulled in two different directions, aren't they, David?
I think they are, but for the reasons that Joe said, that they don't stand for anything anymore. And I think there's a huge fear.
I mean, Conservatives would presumably push back on that.
Well, there is a very strong and I think, you know, arguably very noble tradition of British conservatism that has lots of very long-standing ideas that go back to Burke. That's what the Conservative Party should be. And centre-left, centre-right parties play an absolutely critical role in functioning democracies. They are the bulwark against the hard left. There is an obvious anti-historic role for the Conservative Party, but either your role is to embody that or it's to seek power under any circumstances. And I think that's what Joe's talking about.
And if there's no appeal in the centre, then everyone goes to the extremes. The problem is they've vacated the centre. That's where the votes are, and they vacated it.
Well, let's just dispense with this nonsense which is going round today, that you could just add up the Conservative vote and the Reform vote and you get some united centre-right vote. We polled people today after they had voted, and we asked Reform voters, you know, did you have any thoughts about voting for anyone else? Is there anyone else you would have voted for? And barely over a third of Reform UK voters said they would consider voting for the Conservatives. It is a small
Say that
number.
again. Say that sentence again, and that's the key bit. Barely a third of Reform voters.
So it's 36% of Reform voters, people who voted Reform yesterday, said that they would consider voting for the Conservatives, that would have been a second choice for them in that election. And that's on top of the fact that the Conservatives would lose votes in other directions, to Liberal Democrats and to Labour. And it's really interesting that Boris Johnson has come out this evening and has said, don't merge with Reform, avoid the charm of Nigel Farage. And I think that's really important. You can see those figures I was talking about there. Your second choice, it was 36% there. It is not overwhelming. And 16% said Labour.
Because the great danger is that the Conservative Party learned the wrong lesson from this election.
As parties generally do when they lose. Usually they take a whole electoral cycle doing exactly the same thing they've done before, only more so.
Although Keir Starmer with Labour didn't.
Keir Starmer with Labour didn't.
I had messages from Tory MPs last night. Senior, well, they're not Tory MPs anymore. They were senior cabinet ministers saying, look, if Labour can do it in 5 years, maybe the Conservatives can do it in 5 years.
Well, in a sense, that's encouraging if they think that. But I don't think there's any victory for the Conservative Party to be won for the reasons Luke gives by them moving to the right. And I'd like to just echo what David said, that, you know, from a Labour point of view, it is important that the Conservative Party occupies a good place in British politics. There will be a day when a sane and sensible and electable Conservative Party is a natural repository of the fact that the electorate are tired of the Labour Party. That will happen. And when that day comes, I want it to be a party that is one that Joe likes rather than one that Edward Lee wants to put together.
And let's talk through, Nick, the big beasts, as you might call them. I hate that phrase. I'm sorry I use it, but I haven't had enough sleep. Who have lost their seats, who definitely will not be a future Tory
That's
leader.
right. Well, what I was going to say is that the nature of Rishi Sunak's departure is crucial to how this plays out.
Yeah.
So he has said he is going, but there have been representations, as I understand it, made to the Prime Minister today by senior figures, William Hague, David Cameron...
Sorry, to the Prime Minister?
To the Prime Minister, to Rishi Sunak.
To the former
Prime Minister.
To the former Prime Minister. I was getting confused.
He was Prime Minister this morning. He was Prime Minister.
Fair enough, sorry.
Representations have been made, David Cameron, William Hague and other former ministers to Rishi Sunak saying, please, can you delay your departure? Can you do what they say is a Michael Howard? Back in 2005, when Michael Howard lost that general election, he said he was going, but he didn't actually go until much later in the year. What that allowed them to do is have the Conservative conference in October as the beauty contest, and then the leadership election happened after that. Now, it was quite an effort to persuade Michael Howard to do that, and it looks like that same process is underway right now with Rishi Sunak. Now, I remember this very well because on the last night of the 2005 general election campaign, I was with Michael Howard. We were at a rally, I was covering it for The Guardian, in Selby. We got the bus down to Birmingham Airport, of all places, and we stayed at one of the hotels there, and Michael Howard went off and had dinner, and the journalists had dinner in another area. Then we were allowed in afterwards, and we had a drink with Michael Howard. It was all very nice. He then went off to bed. Then we went into the bar, and chatting away, one of his aides ended up crying on my shoulder, and I was thinking, what's that all about? And I thought, well, clearly what's happening is they know they've lost, so it's a bit sort of upsetting. The next day, Michael Howard pitched up in Putney, which had then been won by Justine Greening, and he announced that he was resigning, and it was on this sort of long fuse. What had happened is at that dinner at Birmingham Airport, Michael Howard said, I'm off tomorrow, and that's it. And what happened was the reason why the aides were so upset is they wanted to persuade Michael Howard to delay it. Because had he gone immediately, David Davis would have become leader. And the fear was that the party needed a new generation, a generational leap. And by delaying the resignation, the departure, that gave a chance to the younger people. Could have been George Osborne. It turned out to be David Cameron. And what they're trying to do do, these people persuading Rishi Sunak to do this, is if he went now, maybe Suella Braverman would get in there and say, let's have a pact with Nigel Farage. And what they're hoping is it will give another candidate a greater chance. And a lot of chat tonight...
So it pauses things, it slows things down, it takes the tempo.
The party, if you think about it, the makeup of the party has changed. The people that are left are the ones that are going to be deciding who that next leader is.
Sure.
So they've all got to have a bit of time of getting in their little groups and working out what they want.
This is a picture, by the way, of
the...
Sorry, Joe, I'm so sorry to talk over you. This is a picture of the people who, some of whom would have been leadership candidates had they kept their seats. I mean, there's some famous names there. Obviously, Penny Mordaunt, Gillian Keegan, the age... Oh, dear. Now we can see the people who have retained their seats and...
But two leadership contenders in there, three.
Yeah.
Robert Jenrick on the left, next to him Suella Braverman, possibly James Cleverly and Kemi Badenoch. They are all potential leadership contenders.
Go on.
Well, I think a longer contest does allow the Conservative Party to do what we've been saying, which is to think, what kind of institution are we? What are we for? They can have a proper conversation about the type of party they want to be. Whereas if they stampede into a contest, there's a real danger they choose badly. Parties tend to choose badly.
There needs to be two halves in that competition.
Yeah.
There needs to be a one-nation centrist side. And so many of them have lost their seats. So you have a much smaller party.
So many of them are part of an administration or successive administrations that failed, that have just had a kick in at the election. Yeah. So the idea that anyone's going to emerge from that group is, it's a big leap for them to think that they're going to get the country to buy into.
So there's more time, but there's a much smaller Overton window of people's opinions entering into that conversation.
And there is a huge gap that has been left in that race, because if you looked at any of the polling of Conservative 2019 voters, who performed best, who had the highest approval ratings, it was Penny Mordaunt. Right. So she was a clear front-runner with people that voted for Boris Johnson in 2019. I think they need time just to find out where other people stand.
And they used her during the debate.
Penny Mordaunt was the Brexiteer who was acceptable to the One Nation group. I mean, Joe knows the criminology of the Conservative Party better than anyone else. And the new person who might fit into that role is Kemi Badenoch, a Brexiteer who might be acceptable to the One Nation side.
Go on, Phil, sorry.
I mean, delay it for a year and to have a whole string of by-elections and bring a whole load of people back.
OK.
Can we talk about
the collapse of the SNP? That was more of a collapse. 80% of their seats they lost. That's a bigger collapse than the Conservatives. Does that mean, certainly in the short term, perhaps in the medium term, maybe even longer, independence is off the table, would you have thought?
Well, I think independence still polls very strongly, particularly amongst the young. Where the support has evaporated, it's for the SNP. This is partly because of the belief that Labour is the only game in town in getting rid of a Conservative government. But in the long term, I look at the demographics, I look at the huge support for independence amongst young Scots, and I think it would be naive to think that this is now off the agenda. It was very noticeable outside Downing Street today that, as well as the Union flag, there were the flags of four nations.
Yes, it was. Yeah, it was. Yeah. I think the other thing that's happened with the SNP is that finally the Scottish people have thought, oh, they're actually the government, and we're going to punish them. Yeah. So for a long time they defied gravity by being both the government and the opposition at the same time, and that trick finally ran out.
What are the Greens going to do with their power? What's Reform going to do? The Independents, Plaid? What do you think, Luke Trill?
Well, I think they're going to put pressure on this new government from all sides. They're going to have that presence in Parliament. I think it was notable.
Oh, the Lib Dems, I'm so sorry. Phenomenal night for the Liberal Democrats. I'm so sorry. I knew I'd missed someone.
Wonderful night for Liberal Democrats. But just starting with Reform, we heard...
Curtis Mayfield.
Were there any
Sweet
stunts?
Caroline. So I was there at the... Sorry to interrupt. I was at the Ed Davey count
sorry,
Kingston
he didn't mention this earlier when we were...
So I was at the Kingston and Surbiton count, and when Ed Davey came in, he said to his aide, said to Lib Dem supporters, "I'm sorry, I'm not paragliding in." Yeah. Ha, 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 ha. Because of all... And then when he turned up at a party in central London, they were playing Sweet Caroline, and very loudly, and in he walked, and he started dancing. Yeah. And then went to the stage, and then off he came, and it was Curtis Mayfield. Now, what is interesting about that is obviously Ed Davey got a lot of attention for all these sort of stunts. But, as you say, they did really well. What are the figures? 71 seats up 63. What is interesting, though, is 12.2% share of the vote. That is lower than Reform UK on 14.3.
Oh, yeah.
And they only got 5 seats.
They got 5 seats and 4 million votes, and the Lib Dems got 70. 71 and 3.5 million votes. Luke Trill, is that going to hack people off, voters?
I'm sure it will hack people off because, you know, there is a clear disparity there. It's interesting that Reform have made proportional representation part of their pitch, part of their ask. But the interesting thing about the Lib Dem success is it links back to what we were just talking about. Because when we would chat to people in focus groups and say, why are you voting Lib Dem? It wasn't particularly for Lib Dem policies. What they would say is they just seem a bit more normal than the Conservatives. Like, I voted Conservative.
That test, you could go out for a drink with them.
Exactly. They would say, I used to vote Conservative because they managed the economy well, you know, they ran a steady ship, OK, they keep taxes low. They've stopped doing that, and so now I'm going to the Lib Dems.
Sure. David, I want to ask you this. Plenty of people did not vote for Labour, most people, as we said earlier. So when Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, is at that lectern today and he's talking about wanting to unite the country, how does a Prime Minister do that?
Well, two things on the voting. The turnout is low, but the turnout is low amongst those registered to vote. And we know, is it 8 million people in this country aren't registered to vote? I think we have an enormous democratic deficit, which is not just to do with the failings and the oddities of first past the post. I think it was very noticeable and very hopeful to hear Keir Starmer talk about wanting to serve those who voted against him, even perhaps more so.
He said particularly, I want to talk to you.
And in some way, it's the opposite of a pattern that I think Rishi Sunak was very guilty of talking about us and them, that he serves the real people. And this is a feature of populism as well. There's the real people, and then there's these others.
Right. Is it possible to unite a country?
Well, you're never going to unite entirely, but what you're going to do is signal that you, as David says, you're a government for the country. I thought Rishi Sunak struck a really good and gracious note too in his speech, where he made exactly. If only he'd governed in the same spirit, in the spirit of his speech and Jeremy Hunt's speech, they would have obviously been in a much better position. But he was making the same point. Essentially, you're my Prime Minister now too. And it would be nice to have a bit more of that.
OK, let's have a look at tomorrow's front pages. The Daily Telegraph. It's a photograph of Keir Starmer and his wife, Victoria, walking up Downing Street, smiling, waving, holding hands. But the main headline is Streeting. The NHS is broken. Nick, we'll come back to that briefly in a second. The Scotsman on Saturday, all change. It's a picture of Keir Starmer and his wife in front of the famous Black Door Eye weekend. Starmer tells UK politics can be a force for good. The Daily Mail, now he has to deliver. Pressure begins already. FT Weekend, the work of change begins today. The Guardian, we will fight every day until you believe again. That was the point he was making about restoring trust. What has Wes Streeting said now that he is Health Secretary about the NHS,
so
and why is it a big deal?
Wes Streeting walked into his new department and then issued a statement that was recorded on video, and he says, from today, the policy of this department is that the NHS is broken. Now, that is a big statement for the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to say, and essentially what they're doing is saying this is how serious it is, setting the bar of expectation in incredibly low. And he has said, you know, Wes Streeting has said before that the NHS is a service, not a shrine. You can't just chuck money at it, you need reform. And he's basically saying we're going to have to do some pretty tough stuff.
OK. We're out of time. Thank you very much. You can all go and get some sleep. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it. Have a great weekend. We are back on Monday. I'm back on Monday. Have a brilliant weekend. Thanks for being with us for this whole election campaign here at Newsnight. The programme goes on for the next Parliament at least. See you Monday. Good night.